We've come to the final chapter. The first three chapters have gone by so quickly. So just welcoming everybody here to the final chapter of our series, which is Lands, Borders, and People, where we'll be discussing an issue that I'm really personally very passionate about, media narratives on displacement. I have reported now for almost a decade on displaced people and migration, and I have done so by putting the people affected front and center of the issue. I believe that human stories and the language we use is critical to ensure not just an empathetic public response, but also responsible political and civil society engagement. So is the media's role not secondary, but in fact primary in determining a social and policy response to migrants and refugees? Also, when we talk about media today, should we look beyond mainstream media at academic journals, blogs, and also the ever-increasing power of social media? As you know, my name is Priyali Sur, and I'm the founder, ED of the Azadi Project, which is the collaborating partner of Asia Society India Center on this. Before I introduce the panel, thank you to everybody who's joining today. This is going to be hopefully a very engaging and important conversation. Just some housekeeping rules. The discussion will go on till 6:50. We will have a question and answer round at the end of this. You can raise your hand and I'll come to you. If you raise your hand, you can turn on your camera, introduce yourself, and ask your question. In the meantime, if you want to keep your camera on throughout the discussion, please feel free to do so. Just keep yourself muted so there's no extra disturbances in terms of noises. Now with that, let me introduce our wonderful panel today. Joining us today is Sukhmani Khorana. She's an associate professor in the School of Arts and Media at the University of New South Wales. Her scholarship on media diversity, multi-platform refugee narratives, and the politics of empathy is extensive, and a notable work includes Mediated Emotions of Migration, Reclaiming Affect for Agency. Pari Saikia, who's also a good friend and an independent human rights journalist and documentarian from New Delhi, India. She's joining us from Delhi today. Pari's work focuses on human trafficking, modern-day slavery, refugees, and migration. And her investigative work on right trafficking of Rohingya women earned her the Grand Prize at the European Commission's Lorenzo Natali Media Prize 2021. And Preethi Nallu is a journalist, filmmaker, press freedom advocate whose work I've followed for a very long time. She's also the global director of Report for the World, a journalism service program that supports specialized reporters in 20 countries and 32 newsrooms. Preethi plays a key role as founding editor at Refugees Deeply and has conducted extensive research, reported on and campaigned for humanitarian and media development issues. Preethi, I'm going to start with you. I have followed the work of Refugees Deeply for a very long time while you all were reporting, and that was, a time when I was also reporting. I do want to ask you this as we start. What really made you start a media platform that's solely focused on refugee issues? What was there a need? What was your goal in doing that?
Sure. Thank you, Priyali. In line with what you just mentioned in your own introduction and what you've done with your own work, humanizing the stories, individualizing the context, and putting the people at the forefront of these narratives, that's essentially what we wanted to do more of at Refugees Deeply, is tell the stories through direct voices, but also as a combination of some of the expertise you just mentioned. So academics, technologists, humanitarian workers, policymakers, in addition to specialized journalists. But I think for today's conversation, what I would like to add to sort of as an evolved, there's been an evolution in my own thinking as someone who's covered this topic in many contexts. What I want to focus on is the semantics and the politics of how media shapes migration narratives across the globe and how it's continued to in different contexts over time, whether within countries, whether across continents due to economic reasons or driven by conflict. So as a case in point, during the pandemic, when the lockdowns were put into effect and national announcements were made, just within the course of a day or even hours, I started to see news pouring out of India about these millions of quote unquote migrant workers walking across the country as they'd been asked to return to their homes. Again, quote unquote, original villages, towns, and cities from which they hailed. And because of my own understanding of the word migrant through a much wider lens, people who move from one country to another, crossing national boundaries, I was a bit confused. until I understood that in an Indian context, workers from different states were being classified as migrants despite belonging to the same country. So this often stated notion that India contains many countries within countries really rang true in this instance. Of course, it's being used by politicians to evade responsibility for a majority of the country, especially the working class, but it is real in different ways, right? So within South Asia, countries within countries, there's several migrations taking place. And this is partly what Refugees Deeply tried to cover through a much more comprehensive lens. So we tried to look at the overall migration from rural to urban parts of countries in search of livelihood. We looked at increasing displacement of farmers, herders, food producers due to climate impacts and poor agricultural policies. Then there's migration from neighboring countries. In India's case, it would be Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Myanmar due to ethnic conflicts, civil wars, economic crises, and climate impacts again. And then, of course, large numbers of internally displaced people, IDPs. In India, it would be in the Northeast and many other conflict-riddled parts of the country, in Kashmir, of course. And so the idea of neatly classifying these movements as purely economic or political, legal or illegal, asylum-worthy or not, became a moot point. And I wanted to cover this through an intersectional lens, because historically, legacy newsrooms, whether local, national, or global, have covered this topic without forming these links. A lot of times they explain the causes, but they do not necessarily have a solutions-based focus. In recent years, that's beginning to see change, and we're seeing public interest newsrooms cover this, and Refugees Deeply was among those efforts. The idea was to break the silos, the artificial silos in reporting between migration, labor policies, climate change, economics, and politics.
Right. Preethi, the fact that you focus on the language, right? The fact that sometimes we talk about refugees as migrants, sometimes we talk about migrants as refugees, and that overlap of, is there a knowledge gap in the media that who write about it? And should there be media awareness around this? Pari, I'm coming to you with this because, you know, you have reported a lot on refugee issues and specifically on women refugee issues from South Asia. But coming to what happened recently, or what continues to happen recently in the northeast part of India, which is Manipur, where there has been a lot of confusion around how the media has kind of portrayed IDPs or internally displaced populations as refugees. What do you think is the need of the hour in terms of, I don't want to say educating the journalists or the media, or maybe sensitizing them around these, these sensitive issues, because these sensitive issues, if not portrayed correctly, can lead to further conflict.
Yeah, so I'm so glad that you asked about the this burning issue of Manipur, because this is something we see being now it did not make to the prime time debate of TV channels. We hardly had the chance to see that. And it's majorly because the mainstream media always choose to avoid anything that happens in Northeast until it bleeds. So they were saying, if it bleeds, it leads. So the issue of Manipur only came into focus, or I would say in the mainstream, when a group of all tribal, student unions came out, did a march on I think May 3rd, and then eventually it led to some ethnic clashes between two groups, Maiti community and the Kuki Jo community living in Manipur. So as a backgrounder, I would like to first talk about what is the issue all about. People who do not know what's happening in Manipur. Manipur. It's like, it is awkward that I'm saying this, but Manipur is actually an Indian state in the northeastern region of India, because whenever you ask people, do you know about Manipur, they say, no, we don't know where it is. It's like a different country. Or if you ask about, do you know what's the capital of Assam or Meghalaya or Tripura XYZ? So northeastern region is made up of 8 states, and which most common people are unaware of, especially even people well educated. So that's very surprising. So Manipur, has been facing communal ethnical clashes for a very long time. It's only, I think, during the initial year of, in the beginning of the year, we saw that that it started, I think, in Feb, when the BJP-led state government started a drive, eviction drive against these so-called quote-unquote illegal immigrants coming from Myanmar. Actually, they're refugees. Living since, I think, 1970s. So, and that's when this started to the clash started to simmer. So people, the tribal community, people belonging to Kuki community, they consider this eviction as a pretext to harass them and to take away their lands, because in Manipur there are two communities, like Meitei is the dominating community, who are mostly Hindus by religion, and they are also Muslims who are called Pangals, and they are so yes, and the language is Meitei, and the other group is Kuki, the tribal community who follow Christian religion. And as per the Manipur Land Reform Act, the Meitei communities are barred or forbidden from accessing the hilly areas, the buying or settling in the hilly regions of of Manipur, whereas the Kuki and the other tribal community people can live in valley areas. So valley region is where the Meitei people live. Okay, and so I think it was in 28 April when the Manipur High Court made a recommendation that Meitei community people should be included in the scheduled tribe list, and that's when that led to a clash between the Kuki, the tribal community, and the Meitei that who opposed of being included. So what we saw is that since the most of the local media is owned by the Meitei majority people, we saw the narratives being biased, giving a different color to the Kuki, Kuki community calling them militants, and as such. So what we found that some of the TV channels, yeah.
Sorry, so I'm just like trying to, just so that Sukhmani also has time to speak, just want to say, so the biases of the media when it comes to these issues reflect in the way they portray, either they write or they publish. And so these biases, individual biases can stay, but the media bias should not be there. And in this case, in the case of Manipur, you're saying these biases have been reflective of the way they have reported. Is that right?
Yes, also mostly because people are unaware of the ethnicity, the culture the Northeastern people have. Especially, you take any region from Northeastern region, the mainstream journalists do not have any idea. So, because of lack of information about the communities and indigenous groups living in Northeastern regions, these people always try to make a narrative between yes and no, or have a balanced narrative between with informations and opinions, which is highly problematic, because what's happening in Manipur is no less than what happened in Myanmar. I'm sorry to say that, because eventually it will lead to that situation, because so many people have right now 54,000 people have been displaced, and this is an official number. The number might be higher than this, and all these people moving to neighboring states of Assam, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland. Many even fled to Delhi and Bangalore. So if the state government media does not report and make the government accountable, for to take adequate actions or measures against the people who are displaced, they will eventually become refugees. They will be forced to flee to other countries, and then what? Women and children we have always seen always face the burden of any conflict or war, and eventually they might become a victim of trafficking tomorrow. So this is my concern right now. And yes, media has a role to play. And recently, 102 women journalists from South Asian women in media came out, released a statement, urging and demanding all the media houses and editors and journalists to give proper coverage to Manipur. And we have seen the Manipur topic has been off the front page of the newspaper. So this is problematic. Why Manipur is not given adequate coverage?
Right. No. So yeah. So the few. I mean, in addition to what's happening in Manipur, I think the key issues that I hear is that the calling a minority group, which is internally displaced people, calling them refugees, and the narrative around these displaced populations, which kind of further the biases. Sukhmani, coming to you, because you look at this issue from a very academic point of view and also on a more global scale, because you're based in Australia. In India and in fact in other parts of the world, we've heard refugees being called things like aliens. We've heard refugees being called, name calling as though, they are illegal, or even all kinds of name calling. Is that something that you've observed, and that the media should be more sensitive or more trained in how they address this? Because politicians may probably keep calling these things, but the media has a responsibility to kind of portray that, whether it's in academic journals, whether it's in newspapers, or even in social media.
Yeah, I think most definitely. So some of the issues that my previous speakers today have raised, Preethi talked about the language that's used to describe refugees, and there isn't really clarity. Even if you look at different cultural contexts in Europe, for instance, refugees or asylum seekers are still referred to as migrants. In the Australian context, and in many other places in the global north, like in the US, migrants is, a term which is, only used for economic migrants. And refugees and asylum seekers, as per the UNHCR definition, are separated from that. But migrants as refugees, or refugees and migrants, continues to be used in Europe. And the boundaries that different countries have, they're real in some ways, especially for refugees. But the boundaries in terms of how countries import each other's policies and how media in turn kind of reflects that without any reflection or any self-reflection, or really thinking about the issues in a deep way, that stuff is quite porous. So all these countries are drawing on each other's policies and each other's media discourses. Something that Pari talked about, was reminding me of my media studies classrooms. We talk about concepts like news values, where a country is at the center, or, whether you have cultural proximity gets reported on more. So, Manipur in the Indian context would sort of be considered, as, central or core to whatever is considered as the Indian identity. And so, that tends to be, people are not as, especially journalists are not as informed, and that tends to be sidelined. Concepts like false balance, where there is agreement that, one community is being affected by an issue like war, more than any other community, yet there is a tendency to report both sides of the picture, which is a sense of false balance. It gives people the impression that they have a balanced story, when in fact what they're getting is a whole bunch of opinions. So there's lots of issues at play, is what I'm trying to say. And I think the media narratives, especially in the right wing or the conservative media in the West, tends to demonize refugees, whether you look at the UK media, or in Australia, papers like the Daily Telegraph and all the Murdoch-owned media. But there's also been lots of campaigns by online campaigns by refugee advocacy organizations. There's been campaigns by people who made documentaries that are trying to counter a lot of these narratives. So I'm not sure that the conservative media is shifting in any way in the way they depict refugees. It tends to be, it's a flood, or in addition to being illegal, they never humanize. It's always like, people who are coming en masse because they're trying to give the impression to people that their shores are going to be flooded by refugees, and hence it's not an acceptable situation. But on the other hand, there's also other kinds of humanization discourses, and I'm playing devil's advocate here a little bit. They go too far and only concentrate on the one story. In Australia, and sometimes in other parts of the West as well, it tends to be the child refugee. And sometimes campaigners think that focusing on the issue of the child refugee or children is going to help us, help create public empathy for all refugees, but we haven't quite got there. So I'm not entirely sure, and I'm sure my journalist co-panelists will be able to say more on this, if it's an effective strategy. It's definitely a starting point. I don't disagree with that, but we haven't got to the point where empathy for, Aylan Kurdi has led to widespread empathy for all refugees. So I'd like to see, how the narrative shifts over time.
So I'm going to come to that point of child refugees, or, getting the human stories out there to kind of build the empathy in a bit, but I also want to focus on the other point of yours, and I'm going to come to Preethi on that, where you spoke about, the conservative media, the conservative media and sometimes conservative governments as well. So Preethi, you are supporting, or your organization is supporting local media organizations in India and probably in other parts of the world as well, and in South Asia, I know for sure. When there are conservative governments or certain governments which have very strict anti-migrant or anti-refugee policies, how difficult is it to work with the media in that kind of an atmosphere or environment where there is already a very anti-refugee narrative? How do you ensure that the media does this responsibly, does the reporting responsibly?
Sure. I think that's a pretty complex situation in the sense that there is increasing sort of anti-refugee, anti-migrant sentiment across the world, whether you're talking about the global north or the global south. But I think the bigger question is that there is actually there are inherent gaps in narratives, even among the public interest newsrooms in how they've covered migration. And if I may share just a few perspectives from my own experience of having covered migration in different parts of the world, over time and through my own reporting, I started to learn two important things about covering the topic. One is to avoid looking at purely as a niche topic, that it should not be a vertical, but actually a horizontal beat, one that is impacted by a host of other factors and in turn impacts them. And the other is not to look at migration, whether the movement itself or the driving reasons is a linear process with a beginning and an end and a cause and an effect. In fact, it's a cycle. So we need to frame the story to match this. For example, a lot of the migration that we're seeing in South Asia emanates from poor labor policies, lack of protections, and social security from the governments. But in turn, these workers who migrate are exploited and their rights denied due to the absence of policies. For example, they could have systematic pathways that allow them to seasonally migrate with protection. So now we're seeing a recurring cause-effect-cause cycle. Another example would be the farmers, the food producers who are going hungry due to exacerbating climate impacts, combined with poor policies from the governments. The lack of protection of their lands and the livelihoods leads to their displacement and onward migration. This in turn produces inconsistencies, right, in national food production and creates more hunger. Again, another cause-effect-cause cycle. The reason I'm explaining this is because it is important to frame stories through these cycles and through an intersectional lens, because it allows journalists and media to report these issues with the solutions focused. And regardless of the type of government that's in place, I think that's what we need to present, is what can be done to prevent these vicious cycles? Where in the cycles do these changes need to take place? Who are the different stakeholders? Who's responsible and accountable for what? What has worked in other comparable contexts? And how can these positive examples be scaled to size? And so I'd love to talk about local media, especially partners at Report for the World that are covering this topic with accountability and solutions focus, but I want to give our colleagues an opportunity to speak as well.
Sorry, I was muted. Sukhmani, do you want to come into this because you raised your hand? Did you?
Oh, I wasn't raising my hand, but I think you're definitely on the money about that, Preethi. And also another concept I've come across is peace journalism, which I think is similar in that the focus is not just on, two warring parties or warring enemies or just focusing on the conflict. It's also what happens before the conflict, what happens after the conflict. And it's also solutions focused. So there's a few different models out there. And I think another important concept that Preethi mentioned is intersectionality, which is an academic term that is getting used by, so-called industry, but especially by journalists. And I think it's a really welcome move to see that happen, because you can't really talk about marginalized communities in this cases. Refugees are marginalized for various reasons. and stateless people are even more marginalized. So I think it's very, very important to have an intersectional lens in this case.
Yes, but the fact that you spoke about bringing the empathy out in the media stories through stories of children or through stories of even women refugees or women migrants, has there been a fatigue that's come in within the migrant and the refugee population, because they've been talking to the media and they feel like not much has happened in terms of furthering their cause? This could be, in different geographical locations. Pari, when you speak to refugees, and especially in your trafficking story that you covered so amazingly, and you spoke to women refugees who were trafficked, was there a trust issue? Did they not want to talk to the media? Did they not want to talk to the journalist? And how do you overcome these? How do you, in an environment like this, where this issue has gone on for some time and very, very small incremental changes, if at all, have happened, how do you talk to a refugee or a migrant displaced person and make that person feel that you're actually going to share their voice in their voice without changing things?
Okay. So, yes, there is a trust issue we see among the refugees, whether it's women or it's a man, and particularly women, because, women narratives play, I would say, attract a lot of attention in terms of, readerships or viewership. So women are mostly, even any editors, commissioning a story always ask for women and children, particularly, living behind the man, which I think is very unbiased and gender biased. So women often complain of one thing, that, how they are manipulating the process of, whenever somebody is interviewing them, journalists manipulating them to, to give informations, promising them not to reveal the identity or the full informations, or giving, disclosing where they belong to or where in which camp they live and all. But eventually they see those informations being out and they feel violated of the human rights violation. I think Rohingya refugee, for that matter, or any refugee living, taking asylum or seeking refuge in any country, are not in a position to give informed consent. The media often encourage us to take consent from people, but how do you explain to them informed consent, because they are already vulnerable? How do you, because if any media person, journalist, happen to reveal the actual pros and cons or repercussions of the story, I think no refugee will give the interviews. Okay, and that's how most journalists, do the manipulations. So when I am dealing with, and when I'm interviewing any women or any victim of trafficking or refugees, I make sure to be transparent as much as possible. I make sure to take time, spend time, okay, be very patient with them. I am an impatient person in general, in real life, but when it comes to my sources, to my people, to the women trusting me, I'm very, very much patient. There were times when I was doing by trafficking investigation, it took me two years, not because of lack of funds or support, because the women wanted time from me, and I allowed them that space and time. And every time I am done with a story, I do not disappear from their life. I keep in touch with them. They do tend to share, their personal space, their personal life with me. I tend to have a very friendly and cordial relationship with all my women, we're part of my story so far, all those sources. So I'm not somebody, like we have been told repeatedly in many investigative training programs, the once the story is done, just detach yourself from your sources, from the subject. But before I am anything a journalist, I'm a human being, so it's very impossible for me to do that. And I think it's unfair. It's a bit unfair, so I never do that. And that is why I think I'm able to, today most of the voices are also, some of them are also, are my sources. And I know we started during the COVID, we started this investigation on how women from Punjab were being regularly trafficked. And because the focus has always been on the men, how they've been smuggled or trafficked to European countries. But the focus was never been on women. So it was a trust, it was, a months of networking and trust with them, the connection that eventually led me to write the story, to reach to that stage. And then that one investigation led to another, and now we are in the are into the third series of investigations. So I think you have to be you need to respect the spaces of your sources. You need to give them time. You should not manipulate them. And there were cases, I think this is one example I'd like to share, because this journalist is quite prominent, very famous, well-known, award-winning international journalist. She went on a trafficking investigation in West Bengal, a year ahead of me. And when I landed up there and happened to meet the same mother who she interviewed before me, the mother just, she started abusing me in front of everyone, calling me that you women journalists always try to take advantage of your gender. So she named that journalist, and she told me how that lady manipulated her in giving an interview, and then she promised not to reveal her, give her pictures, even a silhouette of the body or anything related to her or her daughter. But that her picture, her information made it to one of the biggest publication of the country, and she won a very big award. And that moment I realized that how it is a responsibility of a journalist to be ethical, and because your one mistake could lead to can create a hurdles for other journalists who are going to do a follow-up story or carry on do the same work. So it is very important. You have to be very careful to leave behind a good example and good set of examples for other people to follow you. And I make sure that I try to be ethical as much as possible. And I think that's how I function. People might call me a slow journalist. It does not matter. But I'm not in a hurry to break a big story. What matters to me, trafficking is a cost for me coming from a state of Assam, because it's a hotbed of trafficking. And there's a reason I chose human trafficking as a bit. So it's more than a career driven bit. It's a cause for me. So that's how I like to function.
So I think there's a lot of, you talk about trafficking, but you talk about migrant and refugee women being trafficked, right? So there's an intersectionality happening there. This is what Preethi was talking about. Maybe if we talk about these issues from a more intersectional lens, it doesn't matter what government is in place, but these stories need to be told, and these stories can still be told with all the barriers that exist. I want to know a little bit about, Sukhmani, about how the South Asian refugees or migrants from South Asia get reflected in, for example, in the West or in Australia, since you're there in Australia, and not just in the mainstream media, but also looking at social media, if that's something you gauge. In India, there's a big WhatsApp movement happening. It's called the WhatsApp library. A lot of anti-migrant, anti-refugee narratives kind of do the circles, do the rounds there. So can you just shed some light on how the South Asian refugees are reflected globally or in Australia?
I think one major problem with how refugees in general are represented in the global north is that they're homogenized. So there isn't really any kind of understanding of how, the plight of refugees coming from Syria, or the conditions, or those coming from Sri Lanka, or the Hazara refugees are different. They're homogenized. So that's that has been one big problem. So it's only when you start digging that you'll see that there's been waves of Tamil refugees in Australia at different points of the civil war, in Sri Lanka. There have also been a study wave of Hazara refugees from Afghanistan. And more recently, the Australian government has started recognizing all the Myanmar nationals who, are onshore already, will be granted a priority when it comes to processing their claims. And we've got about 40,000, based on 2020 stats, we've got about 20,000 from Myanmar, although they're a bit silent on whether they include Rohingya in that particular definition. So it's difficult to isolate. Having said that, the Hazara community is homogenized with the Islamic identity. With Sri Lankan refugees, there's been less said, but they've been more readily accepted, unless obviously they're coming by boat, and then Australia has the problem with boat people. They've been subjected to mandatory detention, and the media narrative that's been created by anyone who comes by boat is that they're illegal, which both of the major parties in Australia it's been impossible for them to kind of get rid of that narrative, and it's been ongoing for over 2 decades. But I do want to point out one particular story of a Sri Lankan Tamil refugee family, which which everyone thought would change the narrative about refugees, but I think it's only changed or shifted slightly. So there's a family based in a North Queensland town called Biluella, and it's now called the Biluella family, or called the Biluella Tamil family, because that's how much the local community in that rural town campaigned for them to be able to stay. So this is, the dad came here in 2011, the mom came here, then got married in 2014 and had their kids in the town. So the community sees them as locals because the kids were born there. But, various Australian governments didn't want to make them into an example and grant them temporary or permanent protection visas, because that would lead to other people asking for similar conditions. So they've put them in offshore detention centers from time to time, but the Biluella community created this campaign, and you can Google the hashtag home to Biluella or home to Bilu, and you'll see how powerful that campaign became, because when we had a new Labor government starting last year, one of their campaign pledges was that this family will be given first a temporary, then a permanent protection visa, and be returned to this community. And that happened, I think, the day after the government got elected. So because of this, largely online campaign mounted by this white local community, and the kind of impact that had on the broader Australian community, again, focused on not just the kids, but also on how this is an exceptional family, how this is a hardworking family. That was really interesting, as opposed to, the campaigns that are mounted by advocacy groups that are more kind of vocal about refugee issues in general, or that are seen as radical, that are seen as left-wing. This was a campaign that even a lot of the right-wing radio commentators were getting behind, because it would be seen as pretty unempathetic or cruel to not get behind it. So I just wanted to highlight that particular example that happened to be Sri Lankan Tamil. That's really stood out in the media in the last couple of years.
Yeah, Sukhmani, thanks for that anecdotal, response to the question. I also want to ask you, Preethi, since you speak about, how in the last few years, since you've been looking at refugee stories and migration stories through Refugees Deeply and now through your other platform, and when you look at the story more holistically in a more, as you said, frame stories through an intersectional lens, what have been some of the successes? Like, has there been any story that has stood out, that has been able to make a change, that has been able to change the narrative, even if it's been a small step or a policy?
And that's the important part, I think, Priyali, as Sukhmani just pointed out. When we look at single narratives, they stay in the, they stay in the sort of attention span of viewers for an X amount of time, and, they tend to fade. For example, when I was in Norway, there were certain families of Afghans that received a lot of support from the local community because they were on the verge of deportation. And because certain narratives were very agreeable to the media, they were covered quite a bit. But simultaneously, there were other families that were being deported. And I covered the story of one of those deportations through a documentary called Mama. And so it was interesting for me to notice how, the media was hyper fixated on one issue, one story, but not looking at the larger issue. So how do we fill this gap in covering it comprehensively, right? So a key solution that I discovered, and I'm very fortunate to be able to implement that through Report for the World, is covering these topics as critical beats, and with specialized journalists who are local to the communities that they cover and have intimate knowledge. Pari, I think, is an excellent example. She embodies that, and she just explained her own experiences and how she's connected to the stories that she covers. So having critical beat focus, having specialization, having local media with the nuance and the context cover the topic. That's how I think you cover the issue versus the story. And I think that's what we're missing a lot in mainstream media coverage. And so just to provide a few examples of what we're doing in Report for the World, we support national, regional, and hyperlocal public interest, investigative outlets, because of this proximity that we talked about, but we also foster collaborations between newsrooms of different sizes, whether it's within countries, across countries, or with larger global media outlets that do not have the context. Again, Pari mentioned a lot of that in the Northeast, where larger media do not have the I think she said, the cultural context and some of the norms and the larger history, and also even the collective memory of belonging or lack of belonging that might trigger migration and displacement. So what we're trying to do is form collaborations between these different media. For example, our partners in India, such as the Scroll, the News Minute, and the Wire, they cover migration as a dedicated topic, and they link it to other issues. In Pakistan, we're supporting the Tribal News Network that presents stories of migration and displacement from territories that have been historically neglected and marginalized and do not have good networks even. In Myanmar, our partner Frontier Myanmar is supporting a reporter from a Rohingya background that has proximity and intimate knowledge of ethnic cleansing campaigns by the Myanmar government and their impact. In the Philippines, our partner Puma Podcast is dispelling disinformation tied to migration narratives. So these are just some examples that I can provide from the subcontinent. As you just mentioned before, we're present in 20 countries. So that's Latin America, Eastern Europe, Africa, the Arabic speaking world. And so the idea is to link these trends, these commonalities across continents. As a next step, though, what we would also like to support, and I think this is super important as an investment, is hyperlocal newsrooms. We're still lacking those voices that cover really specific communities. An example is Agência Mural, outlet in Sao Paulo, Brazil, that covers a specific community. The type of reporting that comes out of their journalists is not something that any of us, even at a national level or regional level, could cover. And so this will allow us to facilitate these collaborations between the hyperlocal and the larger newsrooms, the national and the global. And we reach diverse audiences, we reach with different types of impact, and we have a consistent coverage that is able to connect the links, especially between these peaks. As we just talked about the Tamil family, that was a peak. But what happens when that ebbs?
So Preethi, I'm going to, since you already gave your next steps, and I think these are excellent next steps, I'm just going to reiterate those. And I'm going to, since we have just 1 minute, in fact, we lost that 1 minute, but we'll stay for a minute here before we come to Q&A. So Preethi, you say that we have to frame stories through an intersectional lens, and we should have critical beats on migration with specialized people. And the next step should be more hyper-focused and more localized reporting for specific communities. Your two takeaways in terms of making the media narrative or how media should report on displacement in a more comprehensive manner. Pari, and then Sukhmani, to you. Any two takeaways that would help on this issue?
Yeah, I think journalists covering issues of refugees should understand the difference between refugees, internally displaced people, and illegal migrants. So often we see refugees are being termed as illegal migrants. So because that suits again the agenda of the present regime and also the media outlets. But I think it just takes for you to just go for one Google search and you can find the difference between the three, and you need to have a better understanding before embedding yourself in covering such issues. As Preethi rightfully mentioned, that specialized in such topics is very important, because without sensitivity you cannot, a lack of sensitivity would not lead you to, I think it will give a wrong perception and narratives. The perception about Rohingya in the country, it's because of the wrong media narratives given by the government-supported, media agencies. So we need to be very careful, while portraying those people. We need to understand the context of such people, the background, what led, who are the internally displaced people, who are the illegal migrants, who are refugees. I think those terms are need to be studied, and it needs to be totally understood. Needs to be learn about this, and also the media guidelines very important while reporting on such issues. We often see that journalists embedding themselves to cover such issues because they think it's an award-winning topic, and that can lead them to many multiple fellowships and awards. But that is highly stupid, and that could jeopardize to the risk of those people, the refugees, at risk. So you need to be very sensible and be responsible as a media person, and very, very ethical while carrying out some issue. Otherwise, you are no journalist.
So you have to be sensitive. You have to know the subject. You should have researched the subject. You can't just parachute in there because it's a so-called award-winning topic. And you should be ethical and take consent, right? Awesome. Sukhmani, to you, your takeaways?
I think I'm thinking about it from the point of view of the journalism school, since that's most of the people that I deal with. And we've started doing away with this idea of objectivity, because I think that's a really problematic concept, not just in general when you're talking about the job that journalists have to do, but especially if you're talking about, dealing with refugee subjects and refugee crises. In fact, models like Voice for the Voiceless are better when you're considering a war zone, or when you're considering refugee crisis, or when you're considering refugee resettlement. There's various aspects, various stages of the refugee journey that require, as Pari said, a sensitive and a sensible approach. And from the point of view of the refugees themselves, I think self-representation is ideal, but we know it's not feasible because of the vulnerable visa situations and they're in. So I think getting to a point where, from their point of view, I think getting to a point where they get to having self-advocacy or having organizations that represent them is going to take a lot of time in a lot of refugee contexts, whether they've been resettled for 5 years or 10 years or still stateless or in refugee camp. So bearing that in mind is very important, because there is no one person that's going to have, a single refugee can't represent the entire refugee story or can't represent the story of the entire community. So I think keeping that in mind is really important when it comes to representing these communities.
I'm so glad that you raised the point of self-representation, because I think that's critical and that's key. There are some organizations, small organizations, who try to do this in their own way. Azadi is one such organization. We give skills to the refugee women so that they can share their stories in their own voices through videos or blogs. But I think it's very critical. It's not happening in a big scale, but yeah, hopefully that's the pathway forward.